say this is a policy, that's a policy. Everything becomes a policy for the state. So I thought, well, it's time we developed our own policy, our own alternate native four-pillar policy. I was hoping to have overheads, but I won't, so I'll have to read these out, and hopefully maybe we can get copies done, or I can make copies and send them back. It's called an alternative four-pillar policy defining a new Canada-Aboriginal relationship that is equal partnership with Canada, not as subservient, but as equals. The first policy is dealing with impediments to change. Before we can do any change, we have to deal with all that get all that stuff out of the way from the past. And the first one is the Indian Act. Do away with the Indian Act. It's so demeaning to be controlled in your country by a foreign government. So do away with it. Instead, have an Aboriginal-Canada relations agreement. Have an agreement how we're going to live together in this country in peace and share this country. We're always prepared to share. As a matter of fact, sometimes I think we share too much. And they keep coming. The more we share, the more they want. INAC, Ministry of State, instead of the Indian Act, we have a Ministry of State for Canadian Aboriginal Relations. It's simple for a government to instead of having an Indian Act who runs everything, have it as a Minister of State for Aboriginal Relations. That we deal together to come to some agreements on how we're going to live together in this country. Public attitude. No, I still see many people, I hear very often, oh, you're getting tax exempt, you're so well off, you know, you should be giving that money to us and all this. And the government ferments that. Every time they give a grant, they promote it to the nth degree and show Canada, look at all the money we're giving to Indians, and where are they anyways? Well, I can tell you where they are. The people that are getting ahead are not people that are getting government monies. They're people who are earning their own monies. And their children are now going to school. And part of that is through our programs of allowing them the tax exemption to be able to get ahead. And then you're self-sufficient.
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, should be.
No problem.
The native fragmentation, and I won't go into that, that's internal, but there was, unfortunately, one of the gentlemen that when you said, you know, those rights, they really don't exist anymore. So let's define what they are and ensure new treaties are consistent with the new policies. Second area is ensure democratic representation, and that's the work then that we need to do in executive council with parliamentary seats. We should have parliamentary seats right in Canada.
Yeah.
Guaranteed to Native people. Nation representation, in other words. Community administration and oversight. Yes, there is. You know, I say that they overplay the misuse of monies, but there is no oversight. So we need to develop our own oversight system, not dependent on Canada for it, but develop our own oversight system. And with community administration, urban embassies, we already have those as friendship centers, but they should be recognized as urban embassies. When you have a problem, you go to the Friendship Center and you're registered as a native and you get your card. And don't let Indian Affairs deal with it, you deal with it. The community deals with it. Protection of our rights. An ombudsman accountable to Parliament. This was called for a number of times, and there should be an ombudsman that oversees, it's fine to put these rights in place, but oversees the implementation of those rights. And then protect those rights and resolve disputes when they occur. And then supervise treaty implementation. To stimulate development through economic priorities, something that's already starting, but it should be moved up a lot more. Healing of natives. I think sometimes when I talk to people and that are not in the know, they need more healing than we do, because they're bitter and all of that. But that's something we can take on. Let's speak to each other so if we can get that healing going. And healing of non-natives. Aboriginal investment fund, instead of land claims, the investment funds. And have Aboriginal control. Economic parity prior to taxation, but taxation goes back to a sovereign entity of Native people. And then transfer payments. In this way, we can start dealing with those impediments to stimulate development and to carry out the economic priorities. There is a lot of work that needs to be done in closing, and I get so frustrated when we go through the courts and the courts are so prejudiced towards natives. It's the worst place to go. It's costly. The ones that benefit the most are the lawyers. They really get a lot of our monies, is the lawyers. And then we see no good results for it because Aboriginal treaty rights are a non-starter. It's in the Constitution, but they won't implement it. So implement Aboriginal treaty rights is the key question. The way it's supposed to be through negotiations, not through force. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm sorry I used to have it on overhead, but I couldn't do it on overhead, but I'll make these notes available in any case.
Thank you very much, Robbie?
Morning. Morning. So, national oppression and racism remain endemic features of capitalist states in the world today, but in few, if any of them, does the national question play such a central role as in Canada. We're thinking here of Quebec, where simmering national resentment periodically erupts to take center stage in political life, but also the struggles of Indigenous peoples against their historic dispossession, and not omitting those French-speaking peoples outside Quebec whose distinct communities have survived, notably the Acadians. I leave aside, with all due respect to Elizabeth and to Mark, the question of Newfoundland national oppression, on which I think we need to have some further discussion. So I wanted to start with a little walk through history in this part of North America, briefly touching on defining events and aspects of social and political development as it pertains to the national question. The establishment of settler states in eastern North America by both France and Great Britain involved first and foremost the dispossession and subjugation of the native inhabitants through war, through theft, through diplomatic trickery, religious proselytizing, the imposition of unequal terms of trade, and the exploitation of the skilled labor of both Aboriginal men and women, particularly in the lucrative fur trade. The long struggle for the colonial dominance of this area of the world between Britain and France swung in Britain's favor in the mid-1700s. In 1755, after their military success in Canada's maritime region, the British expelled thousands of French Acadian settlers, 'an, 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 In Quebec, population density forced them to adopt a different strategy. After their victory on the plains of Abraham, the British imposed colonial rule on their new French-speaking subjects with the active collaboration of the Roman Catholic Church and the landed seigneurial elite, while seeking to build up the population of English-speaking settlers in both Upper and Lower Canada, aided in this respect by the influx of Empire loyalists who had opposed the American Revolution after 1776. In 1837, the British colonial administration suppressed armed uprisings in both French and English-speaking Canada after years of popular democratic agitation. The rebellion in Lower Canada, that is Quebec, was crushed with particular brutality because it was also a struggle for national rights. The launching of the Canadian federal state in 1867 represented a bid by the Anglo-Canadian bourgeoisie for continent-wide expansion and control of the vast territory of British North America. It was the product of a colonial elite consensus rather than any popular anti-colonial struggle. In fact, it was conceived and promoted by the Colonial Office in London to block American annexation. Efforts to promote a new Canadian nationalist spirit largely fell on barren ground, with the partial exception of Ontario. While Quebec was granted provincial status, it was condemned to permanent minority status in the national political institutions. As for the Métis and Indigenous peoples of the West, the national plan of Macdonald and the Conservative Party of that time envisaged their displacement by a huge influx of predominantly English-speaking immigrants from Eastern Canada or from Europe. First in Manitoba in 1870, and 15 years later in 1885 at Batoche on the banks of the South Saskatchewan River, Ottawa deployed armed force to crush a Métis and Aboriginal insurgency, securing in this way Anglo-Canadian supremacy and delivering a decisive blow to a French-Canadian or Indigenous role in the development of the West. This Aboriginal people from that moment forward faced economic marginalization and political disempowerment under the Federal Department of Indian Affairs, while their culture, and often literally their children, were under assault in the church-run residential school system, as Roger alluded to. Thus, from the beginning, capitalist development in Canada took on a double form of inequality, not only in terms of the struggle of worker or small farmer against capitalist, but also between dominant and subordinate nations within the Federation. The Anglo-Protestant ascendancy that was integral to the construction of the pan-Canadian state imposed a reality of discrimination, impoverishment, and the ever-present threat of cultural and linguistic assimilation for both French-speaking and First Nations peoples. But the denial of the national rights of Quebec and the other dominated nations came at the price of potentially explosive tensions and contradictions at the heart of the federal state. It does not seem that the question of national oppression was ever a preoccupation of the early workers' movement in English Canada. For example, the 1933 Regina Manifesto of the CCF, which contains the famous statement that we are resolved to replace the current capitalist system with its inherent injustice and inhumanity by a social order from which the domination and exploitation of one class by another will be eliminated. Brave words. But securing, if we scour the fairly elaborate program which follows that statement, we will find not one single reference to Quebec nor to Aboriginal peoples. And neither did the early Communist Party take up the national question. 4 delegates from Quebec are said to have attended the 1922 founding conference of the Workers' Party, versus 43 from Ontario and 15 from Western Canada. I suppose it goes without saying there were no Aboriginal delegates. During World War II, both the CCF and the now Stalinized Communist Party supported conscription, which alienated them from the working class wing of the Quebec anti-conscription movement. Stanley Ryerson, the Communist Party's leading intellectual, wrote the most comprehensive Marxist account of national oppression, at least in English, in his book Unequal Union.